Welcome to the Grow Renaissance podcast. Let's nourish the world.
All right, welcome back to Pasture Prime Time, 2026, Season 2, Episode 1. And we want to welcome our very first guest of the season, Jack Washburn. Today's guest is from a company called Kultra, which is really a nutrient management platform, and we'll get into that in a little bit, and quite an amazing company that's up and coming. Jack brings a deep understanding of crop nutrition for all types of operations in agriculture, helping growers build stronger soil. And I will allow him to speak a little bit more about that. But the premise of underlying behind his platform is soil functionality, soil health. He also has a strong understanding of ecological systems, starting from the soil up. And so what does that mean in terms of how we grow and macro, micronutrients? And really excited to peel the onion on that and get into more details. All this leads to more efficiency and resilience in your farm operations. So I'm really excited to have Jack join us today to talk a little bit more about agriculture in North America, his platform, as we kick off 2026. So Jack, thanks for joining us the very first day back in the saddle, as it were. I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey and what brought you through the path that you've taken to actually start building your own platform, because that's not a small feat for anyone. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for having me on. Very appreciative to be on here and have this platform. Yeah, my name is Jack. I started Kultra nutrient analytics software earlier in 2025, the beginning of 2025. And my journey started just working on a bunch of farms. I got into agriculture in my undergrad at the University of Florida, where I managed and worked on a bunch of different farms, including our large school farm, where I managed a bunch of employees and kind of cut my teeth on learning how to grow vegetables. And so I started in mixed vegetables, like high value crops, worked on everything from, 2-acre market garden scale to larger 30-acre like lettuce production. I was picking lettuce next to H2A workers and doing everything from that to then going on and working for a incredible operation where we grew just super high flavor and high nutrient dense foods for chefs in Asheville, North Carolina. And that's where I kind of got very deep into my nutrient management understanding. And so what I saw through around the 5 years that I was working on all these different farms is that there are lots and lots of new tests coming onto the market and figuring out what do people make management decisions based on. Mm-hmm. And so in that time, I talked to, hundreds and hundreds of agronomists and asked them, like, how do they come up with their fertility management programs for everything from just like all of their management decisions that they make. And a lot of them point to some quantitative metrics on these new tests that are coming out that kind of combine all three elements when we think of a soil ecosystem, from physical, biological to chemical, the mineral nutrients in our soil. And you can quantify a lot of those pieces to figure out if your farm is improving or going down. So basically, do you have a graph with those metrics that's going up and to the right, or a graph going down and to the right? And the thing is, we need to be able to correlate all of those different quantitative metrics together with each other. So we're learning that, when you pull one lever on the farm, whether it's, changing a physical characteristic or manipulating the biology of the soil or applying, fertility amendments, it will shift those other aspects of the soil. And a lot of times when we're measuring, we're looking at a snapshot, so a single time of one of those multifaceted aspects. And I wanted to create a software that lets us overlay and create graphs of all of these different lab tests we're getting, so we can see if we apply a nutrient amendment, like a mineral amendment, how does that impact our soil biology? If we take like a soil health assessment with that has like soil respiration rates and those kinds of quantitative metrics, are those going up or down based on the management practices we're doing? And so trying to figure out how to connect all of these dots when we're talking about soil health in this very intricate, interconnected idea, I realized there was no software that did that, or was like able to upload these PDFs or Excel files we get back from the labs, and all of that data is super messy. So I called up my now co-founder and good friend of mine from college. We were backpacking guides together, and he's a back-end engineer that's done crazy data systems for hospitals. And I said, how hard would this problem be? And he was like, let's go solve it. And that's what we did. And so we figured out a way to get all of those lab files from any lab, any test into a system so the data can be cleaned and organized. And then that lets someone like an agronomist or a grower manipulate that data to see, is this area of my farm getting healthier, or is it degrading over the past, however many years they have those tests for? And so that's kind of where we started. And now we're moving on to writing entire nutrient management plans and allowing people to upload all of the products that they use so they can auto calculate nutrient rates and that kind of thing. And our goal is to build just a really solid software for crop consultants and agronomists that let them manage all of the data that they're now inundated with for all of their grower clients.
That's fantastic, and kudos for you for going down that. I want to pick up on a thread where you started, because it's a topic that really came up a lot in the latter part of 2025, which is around nutrient density. And so you were growing crops specifically for restaurants, around the nutrient factors in that food. What was the metrics behind how you qualified nutrient density? Because it's there's some groups out there, and groups that I know pretty well, that are focusing on this. There's other groups that are more agronomic focused that talk about it from that standpoint. Like, maybe you could share a little bit about what kind of models and processes you focused on to sort of qualify nutrient dense, nutrient rich product going to restaurants.
Definitely. I mean, so this was, I think, 3 years ago. It was before I found out about folks like Dan Kittredge and other people in that nutrient density scene. And so I was new, and just coming on to like learning more and more about how crop nutrition influences things like nutrient density and flavor profiles. And so we were doing a lot of bricks measuring, and so trying to correlate like total like solids, like the sugars and the solids in the plant, and that heavily correlated to taste, which we assumed. We didn't do like a nutrient dense like test that they are now trying to develop, which is really awesome. I saw that at Acres and was blown away by the progress being made there. But mostly it was just by taste. We would have the chefs come out, and we would have like two different areas that were managed differently, and we just say which one tastes better and which one smells better. And so like we would kind of go more off of those qualitative metrics and thinking of correlating like taste and a lack of pest and disease pressure with higher nutrient density, which we're finding out now is heavily correlated. And so that was mostly how we were going about, figuring out how can we grow the best tasting crops. And I think a super awesome piece there is that the crops that had the better flavor profiles and had higher Brix ratings, they have more assimilated proteins, meaning like when they pull the nutrients up, the plants can use those nutrients and create like the more complex flavor profiles and that kind of thing. And that leads to a decrease in pest and disease pressure. So when we would be doing like PLFA tests in the soil, the ones that had the higher microbial abundance and microbial diversity ended up having higher flavor profiles. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And being able to track and manage that was something I think is really important.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really awesome. And I spend a lot of my time talking about, the nutrient availability in food. I think is probably the right term. And how it correlates with our chronic health issues that we have, globally. But I really like the sort of slant that you took on it, because I don't speak about it enough. But when we start correlating plants that are producing nutrient availability or nutrient density, as Ken Kittredge, so amazingly quoted and coined, we actually are correlating that, as you said, to the the reduction of pests and diseases and some of the things that we spend a lot of time as farmers combating. You mentioned that there's a lot of tests out there, and I'm going to sort of throw this bowling ball up the alleyway here to you. What are some of the tests that you like out there? We've got the Haney test, we've got high heat combustion testing, composition testing from soil testing. We've got non-soil disturbance testings. We've got soil sap analysis. I mean, there's just an abundance of tests. I think the last time I went to get a package from a lab, there was like 45 different tests that I could actually apply for. I'm like,
Yeah,
again, how do you qualify all of these, the ones I know, how do they differ from lab to lab? So maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I first got into looking into like how the test in like lab market works, it's kind of insane. Like you were saying, there's just so much out there. The way I like to think about tests is one test is not a complete picture, right? Like we every test serves a purpose. There's no silver bullet in these tests. And so how I like to think about it is you have this spectrum of nutrient availability, right? We have first I'm going to talk about mineral nutrients, and then I'll go into biological testing and that kind of thing. And so this spectrum of nutrient availability is on one end, it's what's the total amount of nutrients you have in your soil. Basically, like what's your savings account. And for that, we can look at standard soil tests that have like a stronger acid extraction, all the way up to like total nutrient digest, to figure out like what's our total mineral profile. And then with those types of soil tests, it's kind of like your savings account. So it's like what you have available, which you don't want all of those nutrients, available to your plant at once, or else you'll have a rain event or precipitation or irrigation event and they'll leach away. So then we measure what's in our checking account. And that's using things like Haney analysis, which is something with a weaker extraction or a water extraction to figure out what do our plants have access to right now. And then a plant sap analysis. So looking at the actual nutrients that made it to the plant. That's what we have. That's like our ground truth. And so what I like to look for is if we have all of those as like a baseline, where's our bottleneck? So in nutrient management, I think it's like you can attack a problem from a bunch of different angles, but it's most efficient, especially with the input costs of today and everything, is like knowing exactly what the bottleneck is to get the exact amount of nutrients at exactly the right time, exactly when your plant wants them, getting that system as close to perfect as possible is through finding the bottlenecks and unblocking them systematically. So for example, if you have a really high amount of something like phosphorus in a standard soil test, but then your Haney analysis or your weak acid extraction shows a very low amount of available phosphorus, right? There's some issue in getting that phosphorus available to your plants. That's generally going to be like a biological issue, right? Whereas if you had a very high amount of phosphorus available to your plants, like water-soluble phosphorus from a Regen Ag Labs Haney test, but your plant sap analysis was showing low phosphorus, then that's a different bottleneck. So looking at that spectrum and where the bottleneck is on that spectrum can often determine whether the management strategy should be a chemical solution or a biological solution or maybe a cultural practice solution or irrigation solution. And so knowing exactly which lever we should pull to unblock each bottleneck is super important. And so that's kind of how I think about mineral nutrition. And then the biological piece of testing that is how do you get those nutrients from one section of that spectrum and move them down the line. And so generally what we're looking for are proxies to microbial abundance and diversity. And so we have rough proxies through general soil health assessments where we'll see things like soil respiration rates, which is just correlated to the amount of microbes that are breathing, which is a very broad idea. Something that is getting more and more common, and I'd like to touch on later in regards to just like overall quantifying soil health, is carbon. That's a huge one. There's a bunch of different types of carbon, same as like our other nutrients, like our savings account carbon, which is in things like organic matter, and then water extractable organic carbon, which is immediate available carbon for our microbes. And looking at kind of like our carbon system in our soils, also incredibly important. Because if that system's not working, then you don't have enough food for your microbial life and you can't maximize that population and diversity. And so that's kind of overall, earlier I said like microbial abundance. So microbial abundance is going to be soil respiration, and then carbon, their food source. So it's the maximum population you could have. And then diversity is going to be, there's a lot of tests on microbial diversity. Like Biomakers is doing really incredible work with getting very granular on microbial diversity and classifying each functional group of the microbes in your soil. Kind of a broader idea is, looking at your bacterial to fungal ratios. That's incredibly important. If your depending on your operation. So like a annual row crop operation versus a perennial orchard operation, those are going to need different balances of fungal to bacterial ratios. And so knowing which one of those fits in your context is really important, and managing it for that specific context. And then looking at, like the PLFA tests, I think are huge, like starting point for that. And then getting into things like biomakers tests as you move down that rabbit hole of measuring your microbes. But I think, that's how I'm viewing tests right now. I think, just to sum it up, like not one test is going to give you enough info. It's using a collection of tests together to figure out exactly what's needed.
Yeah. I'm really, really excited about your platform and being able to model some of that, as we put the tests in and talk about all those different components, because every day I talk to farmers. I mean, I was just over the last couple of weeks here through the holidays, I was talking to some farmers in Illinois, some friends of mine, and they're like, "Oh, we just got recommended that we need a base saturation of 6% for our K." And I was like, but why? Like, there's chloride
Maybe.
toxicity. See, but like, don't just take one piece of information. Like, where are you located? Have you done some other tests? And have you looked at the downside? Which I don't think enough farmers, and myself included, spend a lot of time thinking about when we think about our fertility plans, we think about our input plans. We're just thinking about the benefits and not necessarily the knockoff effect that has on the downside. And so to be able to model some of that out and be proactive to say, oh, actually, if we put in, even if we got close to 6% K, that chloride toxicity, in the soil is going to have a negative impact on, our crops, depending on what we're growing, right? And so
Where I see this the most is over application of phosphorus. So every single season, phosphorus, a lot of times with like manure byproducts and stuff, which is awesome, is getting applied. And you look at their soil test phosphorus levels, and it's like a graph like this. If you overlaid a plant sap micronutrient panel, right, that's going to look like this. As soon as phosphorus exceeds a threshold where it starts tying up micronutrients. Same thing with over application of lime and calcium and that kind of thing. Is say you're getting a crop response when you're applying this nutrient.
Yeah.
But maybe it's not the actual nutrient that's needed. Maybe there's plenty of that nutrient there. It's just making it more bioavailable to the plant. And that often reduces potential, like you're saying, those negative downstream impacts. But it depends on case by case basis, because if you have 18 ppm of phosphorus or something, then it would make sense to apply more. But if you have 300 ppm, maybe doing a mycorrhizal inoculant, or maybe doing something that is just making that more available to the plant, and measuring and seeing how it goes, and doing trials and just looking at the data to see which one is increasing overall plant health at that plant sap ground truth level versus just looking at one of those tests and trying to increase a number on one of those tests.
100%. And I've often talked about soil functionality, right? Like, it's this function, it's a system that has to work together, and we're just trying to figure out what cogwheels go. I'm also a big fan of testing during growing season a lot more than just the front or back end of the growing season, which not enough people do, right? They just sit back and are looking at the plants, and they're not figuring out what's going on in the soil during that growing season, which is the most optimal time.
Well, I mean, it's hard, like we're seeing now, like way more people are starting to do in-season analysis, especially tissue analysis. I mean, that's been, but what we're seeing specifically is, because people have been doing tissue analysis for a long time, is instead of doing a reactive tissue analysis, which you see a deficiency and you're like, oh no, what's going on? People are now doing monthly or every other week plant sap analysis and tracking growth curves. This is especially important for nitrogen management and perennial operations. Like, I'm talking to people, California almond operations, and doing spoon feeding nutrient management plans way more throughout the season, because your growth curves and your nitrogen demand curves, and every single nutrient has a different demand curve, and you can overlay your plant sap analysis with that, so you can go through the whole season and know exactly where all of your nutrients are at every point, and what dials you need to pull on a week by week basis, which is is described to me as we don't eat 10,000 calories on every Monday. We eat 2,000 calories every day, and then so do the plants. And so the goal is to the plant's going to ask the microbes. It's going to be like, hey, I need manganese right now, and those roots better give that plant manganese versus just like overloading it and then having these boom bust cycles in the plant, which cause, like these nutrient antagonisms and decreased reliance on that symbiotic nature between the plant and the microbes and that whole thing. So in-season analysis is a huge, I think that's going to be a new, like, what everybody does in the industry, is my guess, is or just an increase in in-season analysis.
Something else I'm seeing, I'm not sure if you're seeing this, there are a lot of row croppers spreading manure on the fields, like particularly this time of year, it's a great time to go out and spread it. But inoculating the manure because they're better aware of what's going on in the soils. And so that manure, which has, pros and cons to application over an abundance, again, case by case, but putting some sort of inoculation on it so it can actually start functioning with the snowpack if you put it on top, the water systems that are, starting to leach into the soils. And I think that is really key too, and this might bridge us into the carbon top. I think there's been a long trend of people applying manure thinking that's going to help create some carbon functionality and thus, enable, an ability to get into the carbon game and monetize it and all this, right? And so let's go get lots of manure and spread it, and then we can just go with a regular fertility plan, and it sort of, it's an imbalance, and it's sort of the lazy man's version of creating some soil functionality. But what it's led me into in a lot of conversations is, do we understand, and this sort of into your topic here, the tick-tock, which is total inorganic carbon and the total organic carbon, the tick-tock of your soil. And I usually win a lot of farmers just by talking about the tick-tock, because they're like, oh, we've wanted to get on tick-tock. Well, you can, it's in your soil. We need to understand both inorganic and organic, and that respiration. I spend a lot of time in the carbon market space trying to monetize and do non-soil disturbance testing. And what I really discovered was there's just a big gap knowledge. People just think CD has to come from the air and go in the ground and just be held there. But we forget about the fossilized carbon that's coming up. We forget about the inorganic, that's there, as well as the organic. Organic, everyone measures. And we forget about the respiration, that we actually have to respire some of it, as much as we're bringing it down. And so, to get these quantified, and I will fully admit, I've got a bit of a bias around the carbon market space. I think it was great in vision, but poor execution. But if we take away the monetizing, like the credit component, which I think is fundamentally flawed right now, and just get back to understanding carbon in our soil as it relates to our operational plan outside of monetizing the carbon credits, we're just scratching the surface on the knowledge base of what's there. Definitely. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, my background is in no way in the carbon markets at all. Like, I've stayed out of that completely. I mean, I think the increased resilience you get on your farm through, being able to go through more severe drought with the higher the functionality of your soil is, or going through, just any kind of issue that happens. If you have soil that's too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold, any kind of abiotic stress, your plants are going to have a much higher resilience if you have a more functional soil. And so I look at carbon as a piece of functional soil to then be able to increase yield and save a lot on input costs, because that higher amount of carbon is going to be, holding more nutrients and that kind of thing. And I think you get the payoff from that rather than from a carbon market. Where I do see carbon measurements coming onto the scene in a really real way is with this USDA $700 million pilot program for regenerative ag that got announced last month. That I've been talking to some folks on the implementation, or wait, cut that out. Don't say I've been talking to folks on the implementation committee. I've been talking to a lot of folks, and a lot of people think, and it's in their USDA documents, that measuring soil carbon and showing a graph of your soil carbon going like this is going to be of incredible importance when applying for these programs and writing a nutrient management plan for these programs. And so carbon, I think, is going to be one of the main measurements that they're looking for on measuring overall, like, soil improvement. When we say like regenerative, that means something goes up. And I think the USDA is going to be looking at carbon as that thing that goes up. And so that's where I'm seeing a lot of, like, measuring of carbon in the next year.
Agree with you. I mean, I think there's a lot of pressure in carbon discussions right now, sort of that monetized component not working as effectively, how that's translating to some of these new programs coming on the market. And I think this is translating globally, like North American based, but we see this in Australia, we see this in South America, we're seeing this in parts of Europe. Some places are more progressive than others. But the translation of how do we create trend lines around carbon? I like what you said about carbon being a key indicator. I often relate it to humans. And for us, it's water, right? Like we don't have enough water, we're out of balance, and we're dependent. And so we need water as much as soil needs carbon for the same purposes as humans need water, right? And it's to create this functional system of things being released, and whether it's respired or leached, and or held in position, right? Carbon tubes, for those listening, hold water in the soil, and so we need carbon in there as much as anything else, and the transference of sugars and other macro and micronutrients. I think one of the things that drives me a little bit squirrely sometimes, and maybe you can relate, is this overemphasis on putting a label, call it regenerative, call it organic, related to nature-based solutions as the only way to create functional soil health. And I think there's like this very, very easy stepping stone, right? I mean, full conventional, and when we understand some of the chemistries that are bad, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But there is a stepping stone to how we continue to create nutrient density, nutrient availability in plants. So it translates to human health. That's great, but also has an ecological benefit. And I think those two together are the equations where I see a program like yours actually really giving us some key indicators that we're great. We can grow really great crops that we can eat, but if we're depleting the ecological system, we're going to continue to be in this, chasing the tail, and we're right back into, over applying the wrong chemistry that was creating poor food, that was creating chronic health, but it was also depleting our ecological. And so we need to balance this ecological and nutrient component, but we can't just do it, moving 100% to nature-based solutions, right? We got to do the stepping stone. And I say this often, we can't forget about the science that got us here, but we can improve on how we better understand the science and the functionality of it all coming together. So I don't know
Definitely.
if that
Yeah.
translates.
I mean, I disagree with all the labels, any label you put on kind of some way to farm. I think it's I get frustrated by it because oftentimes it's something that worked for somebody with their specific context, but I consult for a farm down the road, and then I also am friends with a farm owner that's 3 minutes away. They have completely different problems, and they're a 3-minute drive away from each other.
Yeah.
And so it's like, some bottleneck that when it got unblocked kind of boosted the functionality of soil for somebody may or may not be the same bottleneck for anybody else, and so it just points to the importance of having somebody that has a really strong agronomic background working with you one-on-one on your specific area without a heavy amount of dogma, and just looking at, okay, what's the data saying? Where are our bottlenecks? How do we unblock them? How do we have a graph that goes up and to the right, regardless of where that starting point is? That's the goal. If you're working on, a sandy Florida soil in an orange grove that has a CEC of 4, it's like, that's going to have different problems and require a different solution than, a mixed vegetable operation in California, and so I think it's just important to, not look at, some kind of silver bullet system, but just looking at, like, we've got like 100 plus different pieces of data and all of these indicators that point to the functionality of our soil. And it's just on this farm, on this context, which one of those is the most inhibiting? And that's I think the only way of going about it. You just sequentially unblock and unblock and unblock without looking at, one system. You can pull from all of the different systems to understand, like, you have Albrecht, right? Which in specific soils, balancing the calcium, magnesium, potassium ions, like we were talking earlier with base saturation, like that might be something. If they have, super compacted and, or not compacted, but like cracking soil because their magnesium's at like 40%, like that might be that solution to apply. But if they don't, getting your potassium to 3% to 6%, but you're adequate on your plant sap analysis throughout the whole season, that's probably not your bottleneck. And so applying, one whole system to everybody is never going to work, but knowing the Albrecht principles and knowing, biological principles and regenerative principles, and knowing that your carbon and nitrogen ratio should be a certain level, and maybe there's a time where, applying urea is going to correct that carbon to nitrogen ratio. There's like little edge cases where just understanding like the underlying science rather than going off like a dogma of a way of growing, I think is 100% the way forward. Yeah, the regenerative versus conventional versus organic. It's like, how do we grow the best? And that's all it is. And I think,
and keeping both in mind, right?
Yeah.
Nutrient availability in plants, so it's good for human health, and then ecological outcomes, right? Like if we're improving both, we're moving in the right direction. Like
what works for that grower? What's their goal? Like they might have like 2 years left on, a lease, and it's like you don't know what they're doing or what their goals are, and like that's kind of, it's like if somebody wants to have, decreased inputs over the next 10 years, that's a different goal than like I only have this season. Those are completely different contexts. And so yeah, it's just like what do you have to work with, and what are your goals, and let's follow your
Yeah. No, that's very well put. We've been talking a lot about data, and obviously Grow deals with data in a certain way on a little thing called the blockchain. But without having to talk too much about that, I just love your thoughts around, data collection, data ownership, some of the pieces that we hear a lot about in farming today, and some of the trends that, you might be seeing from some of the farmers that are engaging with you right now, either on a consulting basis or through your platform. Where does data storage, ownership, sovereignty come into play for you?
Well, I'm 25, and so I missed the 2010s ag tech software scene, but that kind of made a bunch of headwinds for me now, to where everybody's skeptical about data because everybody kind of got screwed over in different ways from a lack of data sovereignty. And so that was like the biggest thing I learned, is the importance of data sovereignty, and just like your data is your data, and like it's not sent to anybody. Like I think there was issues with, some of the first ag tech software companies collecting a bunch of data and then selling them, and then that caused a bunch of problems, and now I'm kind of dealing with like the repercussions of that, where people are like, well, where does this data go? And so we've built a bunch of systems to make sure we can say like, hey, your data's solid, and we have no use of giving it to anybody right now, like, and or will we in the future? Like our only goal is to figure out, what levers should we pull based on all of this data. And so yeah, that's like a big cornerstone for us, and something that I've learned with talking to people is just it's incredibly important to have like privatized and sovereign data stored in their own system that's not given to third parties. And it's quite important. In addition to that, I do think collecting all of this data will like it should be taken seriously now, because I think in the future there's going to be a really high use for having all of this data stored and organized and clean. That's the biggest thing, is like having a bunch of paper copies of your soil test PDFs printed out in your office is not that clean of data. We can't do much with that. But I see a future where, crop insurance person is going to look at, is your soil organic carbon increasing? Because that decreases the probability of a insurance payout and that kind of thing. And it's like, yeah. And so and looking at all of these NRCS USDA programs that want to give farmers money and for them to change their practices or be more have higher resiliency on their operations, in order to write the plans, in order to apply for those grants, you have to have very clean data. And so it's just getting clean and organized data, I think, is just very important. But it's very messy, and there's a lot of noise in the data, and coming from all these different labs and that kind of thing. So it's a big fun challenge.
It is. And certainly I think Web3, for those of you in the audience listening, has a play and a role in this to help support what's happening in the Web2 world, and the messiness of, even the most functional pen to paper that translates to Excel, that translates to a PDF, that translates, we can follow that stepping stone in all the different file types. The other thing that I want to mention, not only is it going to be very key in how we manage an operation, and I often talk about diversifying the balance sheet, whether that's a reduction on your insurance or better risk mitigation, better leveraging against getting grants or subsidies or different lines of credits, extensions. But it also is going to be important for the next generation of farmers, because the next generation of farmers are like you, Jack. They're young, they're motivated, but they're driven by technology. And so if we can't put this into a place where they can easily access it from a technologically standpoint, we're going to go backwards before we go forwards, because they didn't grow up with having to read a map. They've figured out what GPS and like technology is part of the functionality of life now for a lot of these young Aggies coming into the world, and even the non-Aggies that want to become farmers. And so I think it's very, very important. The other piece around that is, I think for us to get to an open source mindset, we got to start trusting the data again. And this is where data sovereignty for me comes in as a big player. It's to get us back where that farm 3 minutes away, that farm down the end of the quarter section, they can get into a spot where they're sharing data versus holding it because they're going to get a better price at the terminal than our neighbor, for grain. But they get into this open source mindset because they know their data isn't being used any other way other than to collectively in the same bioregion better support each other. So one tide rises all ships.
Yes.
Which is not an agriculture term, but I use it often in agriculture. But I think that to me is the really exciting thing about where we can go with data, is bringing people back into agriculture in a meaningful way.
It is, and I see the importance of this a lot with all of these new tests we're talking about.
Yeah.
Every context, is going to change what the ideal values are for the values on these tests. So if you take a plant sap analysis, your ideal potassium value is different if you're an almond grower that's in May versus a corn grower in September. Like, those are completely different. Even if you're a corn grower in September versus a corn grower in April, those ideal values are different. And there's so much data we need to nail down, like, exactly where certain things should be, both in mineral nutrition and in the biological like abundance and diversity. Like, what are those ideal values for these tests we're taking? Like, take as many tests as we want, but if we don't know if the number we get back on that test means too low or too high, and then how does that translate to a management practice? Like, there's no point in taking the test. And so with all of these new tests coming on, we also need the target values for those tests, and that those target values come about through a large scale data set with a bunch of different contexts, so we can know, okay, you took this test, you're in this region growing this crop at this time, like this plant growth stage, like ideally it should be here. Yeah. And we don't know that for a lot of the tests that we're taking. And so having the collection of data in like some anonymized way where it can be useful to everybody, where if you put data in here, everybody gets more value from it, and it doesn't, like what happened in earlier, a decade or two ago, where everybody can get screwed over from it. It's like, ideally, all of the data helps everybody. Like, the rising tide lifts all ships.
You're absolutely right. Do you get into water functionality testing, or have you yet? In terms of the microbes and the same things we see in the soil, but within water itself, like a droplet of water. Have you gotten into that at all?
I don't think so. I mean, definitely monitoring water quality of like irrigation water is right. Of massive importance.
Yeah.
But can you expand on that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of new research coming out, and there's a lot of functionality. I don't want to overuse the word functionality. A lot of interesting science around the functional components of water. So the same word that I use for the functional soil. But if you actually take a droplet of water, just like a teaspoon of soil has more organisms than we could ever imagine. The same is true within a droplet of water, just to keep it simple.
Yeah.
But a lot of water is what we call dead water. It's just water that is either being overchlorinated or all the things. But we can actually restructure water, and we can restructure it through energy frequencies, through different conditionings, and through revitalization of awakening the different microbes within the water. And that same droplet of water that is restructured has somewhere in that 30, and I have to, don't quote me or hold me to the fire on this one, somewhere in that 30 to 40% more functionality than that same dead droplet of water. And so if we think about water as one of the key connectors between human and ecological and soil and plants, I think we need to do a lot more study around water functionality, and even get into some testing on that and overlay that on what's going on, because the microbes within the water might outweigh or balance out what we're doing in terms of the soil microbes, and whether it's biological or otherwise. But it's really, really interesting science. So I highly encourage. I'll send you some links after this.
That would be awesome. Yeah,
and point you in the right direction. But really, really interesting stuff.
That would be super cool. I'm aware of like the water structuring. I haven't looked too much into it. I thought it was like you have like inherent polarity in like an H2O molecule, and how those H2O molecules connect with each other versus being like all scrambled versus being connected in a structured way. And
there is that too. There's that, and then it gets deeper than that. It's like just the scratching of the surface, right?
That's super cool. Yeah, and I can imagine how, if our water is structured in a certain way, and then our, all of our our mineral ions in the soil are also polar and have positive and negative charges like water. And, when our plants take up nutrients, it's through the soil solution. So those nutrients need to kind of attach and dissolve in that water, both of them being electromagnetically charged. And so getting that into the plant through structured water, that I could see that being something neat. But I'm definitely curious on, looking at the microbial populations of irrigation water or rainwater and that kind of thing. Super cool.
Yeah. No, I'll look forward to sending that to you. And, it strikes me, I mean, we talk a lot about anabolic conditioning, and, anabolic bubbling in water, gives us some of that polarization, plus and minus. But I think about the mycorrhiza fungi system as the same as a water molecule system, and then we dive deeper into that, and so there's so much correlation between soil and water, and really putting those together. Anyway,
interesting.
We're getting near to the end of our discussion here, and I really do want to give you an opportunity to talk about Kultra, talk about your team. You've got a small team, really committed. Give some shout outs if you want. But for our audience, where can we find Kultra? And are you going to be at any events coming up here? What does the next few months look like? But more importantly, how do people contact you, and where do they find you if they're interested in your platform?
Definitely. So I think top to bottom, you can find us at kultra.us. Feel free to email me at jack@kultra.us. I would be happy to talk with anybody listening. Our team is awesome. It's a group of friends. We were all backpacking guides together in undergrad, where we take people up into the Appalachian Mountains and take them backpacking for their first time. So we've been working together under, all kinds of conditions for years and years. And so when we wanted to start a software company, it was a no-brainer on who I would call to start it with. I'd like to give a shout out to our backers, like our investors, Brickyard VC. They're awesome people. We work in this really awesome warehouse with a bunch of other software startups that are our age, and it's just like an awesome place. And then what else? Right now, our goal, we are automating writing the nutrient management plans needed to access capital from the USDA and NRCS. So if you're a large scale row crop operation that wants to apply to some of these programs, give me a shout on jack@kultra.us. And writing these plans requires a lot of clean and organized data, and we clean and organize data and write those plans. And that's kind of what I've been diving deep into, is having lots and lots of conversations with NRCS agents and figuring out how to lighten their load, because they're overburdened and understaffed. And so it's quite challenging. And so if we can kind of do the bulk of writing those plans so they're easily submittable to the NRCS and USDA, and people can get those funds through like equip and that kind of thing, that's our jam. So give me a shout for that. What else? Yeah, that's the biggest thing. We just launched a really awesome new update to the software, where now you can upload all of the products that you use to write management plans, and it auto calculates all of your rates, and you can write recs for total fertility plans, from fertilizer with like guaranteed analysis to biological products, where you can put in their kind of mode of action and how you think that they would unblock a bottleneck. and then chemical applications, making sure everything's compliant and that kind of thing. So being able to quickly add a graph to a nutrient management plan, say this nutrient's going down, and then here's a calculated rate on where to apply it, and being able to do that in under 10 seconds is pretty cool.
And you, I know you're American-based right now, but if we had farmers anywhere in the world outside of the grant component, but just wanted to better utilize their data using your system, are you open to farmers reaching out from Australia, Europe, places?
Yeah,
that
we have to put in kilograms per hectare, which
Yeah,
we will do. That's just like needs to be a little thing on our task list. But yeah, if you're an Australian grower, feel free to reach out. I would love to hop on a call and we'll see what we can do, and maybe that'll push that kilograms per hectare conversion up on our task to-do list. So yeah, I look forward to expanding to Australia and in Europe. So that'd be super awesome.
Great. And I can't speak highly enough of this platform that Jack and his team are building. If you're a seasoned agronomist, if you're a seasoned farmer, if you're new to farming and you're thinking about all these tests, I know I've spoken to a lot of you that might be listening to this podcast that fit in both camps. If you're somewhere in between the new and the seasoned, this is that additionality. This is that easy button functionality that is going to be your companion. And I highly encourage you to be following the progress of Kultra, because this is where you can really start to take the driver's seat again and start to own what the data means for your own operations, and start to really play around with all these different pieces, so that when you get inundated by all the reps that come onto your farm from all different angles of agriculture, you actually have some relevance and can actually have different conversations. And so if we can start flipping the script so you can better serve your operation because of a platform like Kultra, this is where to go. So I'm going to plug you for that, Jack.
Thank you, Neil. That's an incredible point. It's like everybody's coming onto the farmers, like coming through the farm gates and trying to sell a product that you may or may not need. Yeah. If it's some like mineral nutrition product and they say, oh, I applied this on these farms and it had this result. It's like, maybe you'll get that result if that's your current bottleneck, but until you've looked at your data, you don't know whether or not you need that product or not. And so, yeah, great point. That's huge.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. 26 is going to be an amazing year. I look forward. For those of you in the Grow community, Jack is on the Nourish Mart in terms of finding his information as well. So you can go jump on there and get a link, or shortly we'll be on the Nourish Mart, get a link to get in contact with Jack and Kultra, the team. But I think this is going to be just the start of something amazing. 2026 has started off with a bang. So thanks so much, Jack, for taking the time this morning. And we'll catch you on the next episode.
Wonderful. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Grow Renaissance podcast. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe this episode. Remember, it will take a community of us to do the best in the world and truly nourish not only ourselves, but the planet, the atmosphere, the soil, the plants, and the animals on it. So make sure you spread this message anywhere that you can.